Now we have just enough time to hear Olga speak about Gloria, and then 5 minutes at the end, and I'm going to do a Jane Austen thing at the very end.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
So I'm excited to share Gloria Anzaldua because she was really an inspiration to me in the way that she asserted the necessity of reclaiming the denigrated feminine as well as other marginalized voices by bringing our attention to the gifts that are inherently available in the feminine and other marginalized voices, and also the faculties that are forged within oppressive contexts. So not in a way that condones the oppressive systems, but in a way that invites awareness to the capacities that evolve in marginalized groups that can be called upon in service of transformation. And she does this in a way that recognized with humility that the material world is inextricable from spiritual reality. So that our efforts to change the oppressive context that we live in and that divide human beings must be rooted in dialogue with spirit. And that when we imbibe our daily actions with meaning, we're bringing spirit into incarnation in a way that can foster the evolution of the whole. So, let me tell you a little bit more about Gloria's life and her work, because how many of you are familiar with her already? Just a couple. Okay. So Gloria is typically described as a queer Chicana feminist, and she's known for her contributions to multicultural feminism, Chicano studies, queer lesbian theory, and ethnic studies. But her self-definition was much more complex. She liked to describe herself as a visionary, a spiritual activist, and a poet-philosopher. So she kind of was evading those labels. So she was born in September 26, 1942, to parents who were field workers on the Texas-Mexico border. And at 11, she started working in the fields, and when she was 14, at her Saturn opposition, her father died, and she became financially responsible to support her family from that time forward. So Gloria put herself through college and graduate school, earning her master's in education and in English literature, I believe. And during her Saturn return, she decided to commit her life to writing, and she left Texas and moved to California, where she spent the majority of the rest of her life. Her writing was really versatile. She published poetry and theoretical essays, short stories, children's books, interviews, and she's well known for co-editing multi-genre feminist anthologies. The two most popular are called This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, and later on in her career, This Bridge We Call Home, Radical Visions for Transformation. Her essays are included in over 100 anthologies. And her most influential work was her first, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, which really shaped contemporary Chicano and queer theory and identity. It was experimental, blending various genres, including theoretical, historical, creative poetry, and self-representational prose, and also included something like 6 different languages. So from the beginning, she was really asserting her own voice, her own languages, and didn't conform to English being the only way that she would write. So she was really she was best known for this concept of borderlands, which comes through in this book. It's informed by her experience of growing up at the physical border between Texas and Mexico, but also discusses the physical, psychic, sexual, spiritual borderlands where opposites converge, interact, conflict, and transform. And a related concept that she brings up a lot is nepantla, which is the in-between space. She really emphasizes this liminal space where we step into to be transformed, and continually going through the process of coming into that site of transformation. As I mentioned before, she really emphasized non-binary, holistic modes of thinking and action and intuitive knowledge. So if you read the conocimiento piece, which is conocimiento for her, it's a mode of knowledge, consciousness, and action that transcends binaries and is connectionist and refers to the process of transformation itself. She had this way of redeeming oppression by acknowledging the gifts and the faculties that evolve and are forged in those contexts. That, I guess it reminds me of how Delia was bringing up how the wound is sacred, and we'll see that in her chart as well, that through personal healing work, social justice work, we can look to that which is painful to connect us and to transform ourselves. Kind of like the veil is thinnest where we are wounded, so that's where we can connect to sacred and each other. And she's also known for her criticism of social justice movements that are based on resistance. She's quoted saying that all reactions are limited by and dependent on what they are reacting against. So she proposed that rather than resisting that which is, we imagine new possibilities and create new systems. And finally, she really upheld the way that social justice work necessarily involves inner transformation work, both out of recognition that we project out and make other that which we cannot own in ourselves, which perpetuates injustice, and also to recognize that by healing internalized oppression, there's a lot of potential there to connect to spirit and to also change the material conditions that we live in. As we see here in this statement, she wrote, "I change myself, I change the world." Okay. So let's pull up her chart, and as we do that, I'm going to read a passage to bring her voice into the room, and maybe we can all meditate on the chart as we hear her words. She wrote, "The path of the artist, the creative impulse, what I call Koyol Shawaki imperative, is basically an attempt to heal wounds. It's a search for inner completeness. Suffering is one of the motivating forces of that impulse. Adversity calls forth your best energies and most creative solutions. Creativity sets off an alchemical process that transforms adversity and difficulties into works of art. All of life's adventures go into the cauldron, La Jolla, where all fragments, inconsistencies, contradictions are stirred and cooked into a new integration. They undergo transformation. For me, the cauldron is the body. You have to inhabit the body, discover its sensitivity and intelligence. When all your antennae quiver and your body becomes a lightning rod, a radio receiver, a seismograph detecting and recording ground movement. When your body responds, every part of you moves in synchronicity. All responses to the world take place within our bodies. Our bodies are tuning forks for receiving impressions, which in turn activate other responses. An artist has to stay focused on the point of intersection, Nepantla, between inner and outer worlds through her senses. Listening to an inner order, the voice of real intuition, allows it to come through the artist's body and into the body of the work. The work will pass this energy onto the reader or viewer and feed his or her soul. The artist transmits and transforms inner energies and forces that may come from another realm, another order of intelligence. These forces use La Artista to transmit their intelligence, transmit ideas, values that awaken higher states of consciousness. Once conocimiento, awareness, is reached, you have to act in light of your knowledge. I call this spiritual activism." Okay, so now I will begin looking at her chart, and to focus, I don't have the little pointer, but I'm first going to unpack the stellium around her sun, And then I'll take a look at the Saturn-Uranus that is trining that. Oh, here we go. Thank you. Okay, so the stellium around her sun, and then I'll be looking at the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, and finally Mercury opposite Moon, T-squared to Jupiter, with some points on Pluto, but just a little bit. So based on what I've shared and read, I was delighted to find that her solar complex was conjunct Neptune, spirit, and Mars, activism, and Venus, expressing in the way of an artist. So let me focus a little bit on the Sun conjunct Neptune first, and then I'll expand from there. So the most obvious way the Sun-Neptune comes through is her emphasizing and identifying with spirituality, her ability to slip into spiritual realms. As an aside, she had several near-death experiences that really influenced her spiritual life, one of which she nearly drowned at her first Saturn square, and then she fell off of a cliff at her second Saturn square, and in the same year had a hysterectomy. So she had this way of slipping into these alternative states and dimensions and bringing something back that had spiritual value and meaning. And also, in the way that she understands identity, the sun, in this very Neptunian way. The sun is really impacted by the dissolving, obscuring tendency. And in her work, we see her successfully grappling with this archetypal combination. She describes in her childhood having an experience of self-discontent and confusion, which can come through with the sun Neptune. She wrote, "In the eyes of others, I saw myself reflected as strange, abnormal, queer. I saw no other reflection." So for the Sun-Neptune person who needs a reflection back in order to know oneself, she really spoke to the damage that occurs when what is reflected back is only negative. And she also described identity as this liminal, in-flux, chameleon-like experience. She wrote, "Identity is a changing cluster of components and a shape-shifting activity." So we see that coming through again. She also wrote, "Identity, like a river, is always changing, always in transition, always in nepantla. Like a river downstream, you're not the same person you were upstream. You begin to define yourself in terms of who you are becoming, not who you have been." And likewise, she emphasizes the pluralistic nature of social identity, always acknowledging that her social identity exists at the intersection of white, Mexican, Indian, that social identity can't really be defined in binary ways. And her gender identity as well, she described herself as a lesbian by choice, and she experienced her gender identity as a fluid interplay of masculine and feminine energies. Perhaps that has to do with the Venus-Mars, both conjunct her sun. She wrote that, "I, like other queer people, am two in one body, both male and female." So based on all of this, it makes sense that she rejected the issue-based, identity-based, identity-specific alliances that were arising in the social justice movements in the 70s. And as her collaborator described, Gloria invented new forms of relational, inclusionary identities based on affinity rather than social categories. So this Neptunian, in my understanding, identity theory was really a central thrust to her work. Perhaps because of the challenge to know herself and making it something that she had to consciously overcome. We also see Sun-Neptune in the way that she uses images. I think you would have experienced that in the essay that you read. But she also describes that in her writing process, it was really an experience of connecting to images first and then words flowing through that way. Kind of like we were talking about the experience of being a medium, connecting to the collective unconscious and channeling words through that way. We also see Neptune in her idealism, her really high standards for herself and for society, the desire to surpass ordinary reality. Yes, and many criticized her perspective as being too idealistic. Likewise, people criticized her for being too angry, which I'll transition to Mars now. So, interestingly, we have the Sun-Neptune conjunction, but it's also conjunct Mars, which brings through leadership, ambition, courage, this fighting against social injustice for the sake of others. And despite the Neptunian potentiality of withdrawing into the spiritual or into herself, she really emphasizes the necessity of action and will. She writes, "To activate the conocimiento and communication, we need the hand. The hand is an agent of action. It is not enough to speak and write and talk and communicate. It's not enough to see and recognize and know. We need to act upon which we know, to do something about it. The left hand has always been seen as sinister and strange, associated with the female gender and creativity. But in unison with the right, the left hand can perform great things. It's not enough to theorize and intellectualize. Theory needs to connect with action, with activism." So as I mentioned, there's a lot of anger that comes through in her work, and that was something that she was criticized for. And also, I see the the Mars-Sun coming through in the way that she, at the same time, has a conflict with and an identification with the masculine within her own self and in society. Also, the Mars-Neptune-Sun perhaps is this proneness to accidents, as we bring in Saturn as well. And finally, Venus, also involved in this stellium, that's her artistic sensibility, the way that she sees herself as an artist first and foremost, and expresses herself that way. And also her love of spiritual activism. And another piece is there's a centrality of loving yourself. So Sun being the self and Venus being love, that comes through in her work. That's the place where we begin spiritual activism, is to look within and start to heal our own wounds. And also strong valuing of the feminine and her popularity, especially with women. So now I want to discuss a little bit the Sun-Uranus conjunction, Saturn-Uranus conjunction that is trining to the stellium. So there's a lot going on here. So Uranus is rebellion. It's the desire for freedom, the desire to change and be liberated, seeking liberation from constraints of the past, whereas Saturn is exactly those constraints. So the rigid, oppressive structures of society, patriarchy, racism, classism, heteronormativity, etc. Saturn also can represent repression, stagnation, shame. And so the conjunction of the two, and living with that, there's this tension between restriction and freedom, and the possibility for pervasive tension that erupts with sudden breaks from that tension. Rebellion, Uranus, against the boundaries of society, Saturn, or Saturn being the imposition of those limitations on one's personal freedom. Also, there's this tension between the past and the future. She has this way of retaining what's valuable from her past, from her ancestry, her language, while advocating for change around oppressive social structures and synthesizing the beliefs and values of the past with current scientific knowledge, with new ways of thinking and knowing. Also, her ability to facilitate liberating change with discipline, Saturn, and the ability to persist under difficult, oppressive conditions. So, Uranus being trine her stellium, we see that in the way that she expresses herself in a really unique, unconventional way that liberates others, both of those being Uranian qualities. And Saturn, I see it coming through in the way that it tempers her stellium, bringing in responsibility, dedication, discipline, sculpting herself, the stellium, through adversity, Saturn. The conjunction combines particularly with Neptune, Uranus bringing in revolutionary ideals, interests in the mystical and the occult, her near-death experiences, her visionary nature, and the idea of conocimiento in general I see as a Neptune-Uranus capacity, this suddenly breaking into new awareness, new ways of imagining the world. Whereas Saturn, I see that as her Saturn-Neptune, it comes through in a lot of different ways, but one is her permeability and sensitivity, Neptune, to suffering, Saturn, in the world, and like we've talked about, the sacred wound. And also it comes through in her ability to bring ideals, Neptune, into manifestation, Saturn. From a very mature Saturn place, she writes, "Nothing happens in the real world until it first happens in the images in our heads." Okay. So moving forward, the way that the conjunction interacts with Mars is that particularly fiery, rebellious, nonconformist, fighting for freedom energy. And the Saturn might play in there with inhibited anger, frustration, and at the same time, painstaking work, hard work. And it combines with Venus in a variety of different ways, but I'll keep it brief, namely unconventional love relationships, her unusual creativity, that being the Uranus. And Saturn is the difficulty that she describes having in relationships, the blockages of love. She also describes using art to liberate from cultural oppression. She writes, "In creating artistic work, the artist's creative process brings to the page the unconscious process of the imagination. By awakening and activating the imagining process in the viewer, La Artista empowers us. The imagination gives us choices and options from which to free ourselves from the jaws that culture locks us in." So the jaws of culture, that would be Saturn, and art, Venus, being the mechanism that liberates Uranus. Okay, I'm noticing I'm running low on time. I do want to mention that I pulled out the Saturn-Uranus conjunction in her chart because when there were collective Saturn-Uranus transits were some of the peak points in her work. When Saturn-Uranus square in the sky was aspecting her natal conjunction, she moved out to California and began working on this bridge called My Back. And then later, when Saturn-Uranus were conjunct, squaring her stellium, she published her first solo work. And then when Saturn-Uranus were square again in the sky, this time conjoining her moon, she began working on this bridge we call home. Okay. So I'm not going to say too much about Pluto, but it is the midpoint between the stellium and the conjunction of Saturn-Uranus. Just empowering the whole dynamic, the death, rebirth mystery, and the place where she seems to dwell a lot of the time. And finally, I want to speak to the Mercury opposite Moon and potentially T-square Jupiter. We're working with a noon chart, but any time during this day, it would be Mercury-Moon opposition. And I see that coming through in a couple of ways. Firstly, the confluence of thought, communication, Mercury, and feeling, Moon. Writing and speaking about the inner private world. She was also recognized for generating intimacy through her work, through her writing in particular. And her emphasis on non-rational thought, alternative ways of knowing, intuitive knowing, knowing through the body. She emphasized the body a lot in general and described that like a shaman, we transmit information from our consciousness into the physical body of the other. And the other way that I see the moon Mercury coming through is that much of her work was focused on fostering collaboration between women, women and men in her later book. So rather than focusing on solo writing, she brought people together. So if moon is the communal space, she's bringing that out through writing. And also, side note, she wrote books for children, which would be Mercury, moon as well. And I see Jupiter coming into play mainly in the way that she was successful and well received for her works. Also that the subject matter of her works was philosophical, moral in nature, focusing on fairness, justice, equality, and the way that she would speak on behalf of others in a nurturing, protective way. The whole complex really resonates for me with the way that she describes herself as a poet, philosopher. So I will wrap there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to give voice to these women that carry visions of feminism and post-patriarchal society with such archetypal resonance. So thank you. It was a pleasure. Yes.
I got to get going soon. I just want to say thank you for bringing her in. If anyone didn't get a chance to read the reading that she presented, I highly recommend it. It's very good. And yeah, she's just such a great bridge between, she talked about bridges a lot, and this whole idea of, I love how she carries the spiritual aspect. She has the near-death experiences, is really, looking at the collective struggle that involves everything. Without flying away from the particularities and the solidarity that needs to happen. I find that a lot of times we either fly totally out in the kind of meta picture, or when you get on the ground and focus on the system's oppression, sometimes it can it tends to be oppositional to that which needs to be overthrown, but in a way that's really hard to integrate it. And I've actually been struggling a lot with that, especially in this microcosm, CIS and everything. It's just a perfect. Such a good integration tool for all of that. So I can't recommend the reading enough in her. She's just wonderful. Thank you, Olga. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. That was very well put.
Any last things? That was beautiful. Very good job on a complex person and thinker. I liked so many of the points that you made. I love the image that you chose of her in the water in a kind of yang, clothing and movement. Reminded me of John Keats with his Sun Neptune conjunction. Here lies one. This is on his epitaph. Here lies one whose name was written in water. And I think you kind of said this, but I'll just bring it out maybe a little bit more often with that Saturn-Uranus conjunction is accidents, bone breakages, and at their most intense, near-death experiences. The most intense would be a sudden death, the actual, but near-death experiences, and then, as you say, this becomes a kind of avenue into the Neptunian transcendent experience. And I think, in agreement with what you're saying, that Pluto, right exactly at the Mars-Uranus midpoint, the potent warrior, rebel warrior. I even think, both with her and we are also seeing it with Joni Mitchell, that there's a broad Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. I think there's a lot of cultural power that she had and moral power to transform, and the desire to uplift and transform the culture. I think that there's a Jupiter-Pluto energy that I notice that people born in that second half of 1942, even when it's 15 degrees away, they're already carrying it. Hendrix, and born a couple months later, also has that. Okay, just great job.